Imagine for a moment that everything you thought you knew about African history, about who held the sword, who led the charge, who bled for freedom, had been kept from you. Not misplaced, not forgotten, right, deliberately, systematically, methodologically brought under countries of colonialism, miseducation, and the deeply uncomfortable truths that empire has never wanted told. Imagine that an entire class of warriors, thousands of them existed for 200 years and were almost erased from the common consciousness of the world because the people in power decided their story was too dangerous, too environment, too extraordinary to be widely known. Now imagine that a move comes along the dikes, it all back up, not quality, not with apologize, not with the mind, not with the timed headgang voice of a film that is not sure if it's allowed to say what it wants to say. This movie comes along this concept thought fire and steel through sweat and tears thought the thundering whispered sound of women was crashing through the silence of history like a force of nature that was never ever supposed to forgotten. That is what the woman king does, and that right there is exactly why we are here today. But before we go a single step further, I need you to understand something fundamental about this film. Because if you walk in thinking this is just a historical action movie, just a cool period piece with some impressive fight sequence and a charismatic lead, you will miss almost everything that makes it worth talking about of hours. This movie is not just a historical drama. It is not just an action film. It is not just a story about Africa or about women or about war. It is a story about what it means to fight for some things when the entire world has already decided your faith. It is a story about mothers and daughters, preached by Valiant and reunited by something neither of them fully understand. It is a story about it is a story about shame and redemption, about the peace of survival and the cost of actual freedom. Not the kind of freedom that looks good as speech, but the kind that costs you everything and still might not be enough. At at the absolute center of all of it, holding the entire thing together with her bare hands and the full terrifying weight of her craft is one of the most powerful performances you will ever see committed to a movie screen. So, still in, get comfortable because we are going to go through every layer of this film. We are going to walk through the story scene by scene, feel every emotional beat, analyze every character, explore every theme, examine the craft behind the filmmaking, engaging honestly with the controversies. And by the time we are done, you will understand not just that happened on screen, but why it matters, why it shocked people, why it made grown adults cry in movie theaters, why scholars they debated it for months, and why years after its release it remains one of the most significant films of its decade. Let's start from the very beginning. The Woman King arrived in American theaters on September 16, 2022. Directed by Gina Prince Bethwood, a filmmaker who has spent 2 decades crafting intimate, emotionally intelligent stories that happen to also be genuinely thrilling. The film was produced by Terrestrial Pictures and distributed by Sony Pictures Entertainment. It carried a production budget estimated between 50 and 60 million dollars, respectable but not extravagant for a film of this scope and ambitions, and it went to on to gross approximately $67 million worldwide, a number that tells one story financial but tells a completely difficult story, a different story culturally. When you look at who saw it, who they responded, and what conversations it generated long after the opening weekend had passed. The cast assembled for this film is frankly extraordinary. Viola Davis leads the film, Nasia, the General of Gojier, the all-female war unit that protect and serve the kingdom of Dome in what is now the West African nation of being during the 19th century. If you know anything about Viola Davis, if you have watched How to Get Away with Murder, if you have seen Fences, if you have any familiarity at all with what she is capable of as an actress, then you already understand that this casting alone was sufficient reason to show up opening weekend. She is one of the most finest performance alive, and this film gives her more than it gives most extra in a lifetime.
Supporting her with equal commitment is Thusom Badu, a South African actress who plays Nawi, a headstrong, fiercely independent young woman who becomes a recruit in the Agoji and whose journey is the film's primary narrative through line. Badu was already recognized internationally for her devastating work in Barry Jenkins's limited series The Underground Railroad, but the Woman King asks something different and larger of her, and she rises to it with a completeness that announces her as a major talent. Then there is Lashana Lynch as Izagi, one of the senior Agoji warriors tasked with training the new recruits, fierce, physically electric, and possessed of a humor and warmth that the film absolutely depends on. John Boyega plays King Gizo of Dahomey with a thoughtful, morally ambiguous complexity that tends to get somewhat overshadowed by the force of the female performances surrounding him, but deserves genuine recognition. Sheila Adam plays Amenza, Naniska's oldest and closest confidant, with a quiet, almost devastating emotional depth. And Jordan Bolger plays Malik, a young mixed-heritage man connected to the Portuguese slave trade, whose relationship with Nawi provides the film's most conventional romantic thread, but also its most direct connection to the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade as it affected the African diaspora. Now, context. Because context is everything with a film like this. The Agoji were real. I want to say that again because it cannot be said too many times. This is not a fantasy. This is not science fiction. This is not a speculative reimagining of a world that never existed. The Kingdom of Dahomey maintained a core of female soldiers, an elite, professional, feared military unit composed entirely of women, for the majority of its history, from roughly the early 17th century through the very end of the 19th century, when French colonial forces finally defeated Dahomey after a brutal campaign. At their height, the Agoji numbered in the thousands. They were among the most feared fighting forces on the entire African continent. European colonists and soldiers who encountered them in battle were, by every historical account available, stunned by their ferocity, their discipline, their tactical intelligence, and the sheer ideological impossibility, as far as European minds of the era were concerned, of women as professional warriors operating at the highest possible level. That shock, that cognitive dissonance, the world had not expected them, could not accommodate them within its existing framework, became part of what made the Agoji so formidable. They were not just warriors. They were a living argument against every assumption the world had made about what women could and could not be. The film is set specifically in the 1820s, a period of intense political tension in the region. The Oyo Empire, a major power that had previously dominated much of what is now Nigeria and Benin, was in a state of gradual decline but still militarily significant and actively hostile to the growing ambitions of Dahomey. The Portuguese slave trade was at a complicated juncture, with various European and colonial powers maneuvering for position and influence in West Africa. And Dahomey itself was navigating a treacherous path, a relatively small kingdom surrounded by larger, more powerful neighbors, maintaining its independence through a combination of military strength, political cunning, and its participation in the trade in enslaved human beings. The film is not a strict historical documentary. It takes creative liberties that are significant and that we will engage with honestly and fully. But the bones of it, the cultural foundation, the spiritual core of who the Agoji were and what they represented, that is grounded in something real, something documented, something that the world has been far too slow to recognize and honor. When the film was first announced, the anticipation, particularly within Black American communities, within the African diaspora broadly, and among film lovers who had spent years hungry for exactly this kind of prestige, epic storytelling centered on African history and told from an African perspective, was enormous. The early trailers were electric. The footage of Viola Davis in battle, her face carved into something that looks almost like a force of nature rather than a human being, circulated everywhere. People talked about it with that specific, urgent, particular excitement that comes not just from wanting a good movie, but from needing one. From needing to see something that is yours, that is true, that is powerful and beautiful and complex, represented on the biggest possible stage. And when the film came out, the critical response was, by any measure, strong. The film holds an 89% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 74 on Metacritic. Viola Davis received multiple awards nominations and wins. The National Board of Review named it one of the best films of 2022. And in theaters, particularly at screenings attended by Black women and girls, the response was something beyond standard film appreciation. It was recognition, emotional release, celebration. People wept. People cheered during fight sequences. People walked out talking about it the way you talk about an experience that changes something in you, even if you can't quite articulate what. There were also controversies. Serious ones, raised by serious scholars. And we will get to all of that with full honesty. But first, the story. Because the story is everything, and it deserves to be told with the care and attention it was made with. The film does not ease you in. There is no gentle introduction. No establishing title card explaining the history, no voiceover narrator contextualizing the world. Gina Prince Bythewood respects her audience enough to drop them directly into the reality she has created, trusting that they will find their footing. And so the film opens in darkness. In the night. In the kind of deep, primal, African bush darkness that is not just the absence of light, but a presence of its own, something alive and watching and breathing. We can hear movement, we can sense presence, but we cannot yet see clearly. And then slowly through the trees, torchlight, the warm, flickering orange of fire casting moving shadows. And beneath those shadows, a grim tableau, a group of Oyo soldiers moving through the forest with a line of captives, men, women, children, bound with ropes and chains, their faces registering the specific, hollowed-out exhaustion of people who have been walking for a long time in the direction of something terrible. These are enslaved people in transit, being moved from one horror to another. The Oyo soldiers are relaxed, confident, talking among themselves, occasionally laughing. They feel entirely safe. They are not safe. The camera finds a pair of eyes in the darkness. Still. Completely, preternaturally still. Viola Davis's eyes. And in the 2 or 3 seconds before anything happens, in that moment of absolute suspended quiet, Gina Prince Bythewood gives you something that most action directors don't bother to include in their opening sequences. She gives you the predator's consciousness. The awareness of someone who has been here before, who has done this before, who knows exactly what is about to happen and has already run through every variable. And then she gives you the command. It is not a shout. It is barely a word. It is a breath made into an instruction. And the Agoji come out of the dark. What happens in the next 4 or 5 minutes is one of the most viscerally effective opening action sequences in recent Hollywood filmmaking history. The Agoji move with a terrifying, almost choreographically perfect efficiency that immediately communicates everything you need to know about them. This is not a first battle. This is not improvisation. This is practiced, refined, repeated over years and decades until it has become something as natural as breathing. They do not waste motion. They do not make unnecessary sounds. They are a machine made of human beings, and every component of that machine knows exactly what it is supposed to do and does it without hesitation. The fight choreography, developed in extraordinary detail by the film's fight coordinator and second unit director Alexa Marcelino, who worked with a cast for months before principal photography began, is individualized in a way that is rare in ensemble action sequences. Naniska fights like a general, always aware of the whole field, always processing information and making decisions that account for the positions of her warriors, the movement of the enemy, the safety of the captives. She is not just a fighter. She is a battlefield thinker operating in real time. Izagi, in these early glimpses of her in combat, fights with a kind of exuberant, almost joyful ferocity that tells you this is a woman who is genuinely, almost unsettlingly good at something she was made for. These distinctions matter. They tell you who people are. The captives are freed. The Oyo soldiers are defeated. And this is the moment that first tells you this film is going to be something different. The Agoji don't celebrate. They don't stand over the fallen enemy with raised weapons. They check on each other. They look into each other's eyes and count. They hold the ones who are hurt. They grieve the ones who are gone. Because this is the other side of who they are, the side that war movies almost never bother with. They are warriors, yes. Ferocious, disciplined, legendary warriors. But they are also women who love each other with a depth and a specificity that has been forged in exactly these kinds of moments. They are a family, and family, in this world, means you never stop counting each other. This opening sequence accomplishes something essential and relatively rare in mainstream cinema. It establishes the world and the tone without over-explaining either of them. You do not need a history lesson to understand what you have just watched. You feel it. You are inside it before you have had time to process it intellectually. And that immersive immediacy is a deliberate, confident directorial choice that sets the terms for everything that follows. We move from the aftermath of the raid into Dahomey itself, the kingdom, the capital city of Abumi, the palace grounds, the compound of the Agoji, the political and social world that surrounds and sustains them. And here, in these early sequences of the film's first act, Gina Prince Bythewood begins layering in the second story, the personal story, the story of a young woman at the beginning of her journey that will eventually converge with Naniska's in the film's emotional center. We meet Nawi. She's being brought, by her father, and by the look of things rather forcibly, to the palace. And she is not going quietly. This is not a girl who does anything quietly. The Sombidu introduces Nawi in a state of raw, barely controlled fury, eyes bright, chin up, defiance radiating off her like heat, and immediately you understand two things about her. First, she has tremendous courage, and second, she has absolutely no idea what to do with it. The courage is real, and it is her truest quality, but at this stage of her life it is undisciplined, reactive, pointed in whatever direction the nearest injustice happens to be. Which is to say, it is pointed in a lot of directions simultaneously, and none of them particularly strategic. Her father has brought her here because she refused to marry the man her family chose for her. She did not merely refuse. She hid him because he tried to take what he believed was already his. And her father, his pride and his arrangements both in ruins, has decided the most practical solution is to hand her over to the king, a common practice in Dahomey, where the palace could take young women into service. From the palace's population, the most physically capable and temperamentally suited could be considered for recruitment into the Agoge. There is a painful irony in this moment that the film is aware of and that the audience will fully feel only in retrospect. Nawi's father is disposing of her, treating her as a problem to be solved, a commodity to be redirected. He is, in the most fundamental sense, exercising precisely the kind of ownership over his daughter's body and future that Nawi has just refused to accept from her prospective husband. He is doing to her what she rejected from someone else, and he sees no contradiction in it. And Nawi, for all her fire and her defiance, has no power to stop it. She is furious and helpless simultaneously, which is perhaps the most exhausting combination of emotions a person can inhabit. What she does not know, what neither she nor the audience fully understands yet, is that this moment of indignity is the beginning of the most important chapter of her life. At the palace, Nawi enters a world that is simultaneously confined and more expansive than anything she has previously known. She meets the other recruits, girls and young women from various backgrounds and circumstances, some eager for the opportunity, some terrified, some already showing the specific quality of stillness beneath the surface that will later be recognized as the first sign of a true warrior. They are assessed. They are evaluated. They are observed. And the woman doing most of the observing with those characteristic eyes that see through rather than simply at is Naniska. But it is not Naniska who will become Nawi's primary guide through this new world. That role belongs to Izagi. Lashana Lynch's Izagi is one of the film's greatest and most enduring pleasures, and I want to spend some real time on her because she deserves it. She is a senior Agoge warrior, which means she has survived, has chosen to remain, for years in a life that breaks most bodies and many spirits. She has seen recruits come and go. She has watched girls arrive full of promise and wash out in the first month. She has trained women who became legends and women who became graves. She has seen it all. And yet she is not jaded. She is not dismissive. She still shows up to every training session with the same total investment in the possibility that the person in front of her might be exceptional. When she meets Nawi, she sees something. It is not quite potential in the conventional sense. It is more like raw material that nobody has had the patience or the skill to work with properly yet. Wild, unpolished, constantly on the verge of getting itself killed. But underneath all that volatility, Lynch conveys, through glances, through a reluctant half-smile, through the specific quality of attention she gives to watching Nawi move, that Izagi recognizes something real, something worth the trouble. And the trouble, let's be clear, is considerable. The training sequences that follow are where the film's first act finds its beating heart. These are not montage sequences designed to show transformation in a clean, inspirational arc. They are extended, detailed, often uncomfortable scenes that show the actual process. The pain, the failure, the humiliation, the small incremental improvements that are almost invisible day by day but that are slowly, inexorably building something new. We watch Nawi run until she cannot run anymore, then be expected to run further. We watch her fight opponents who are stronger, faster, more experienced, and lose, and then get back up and fight again. We watch her chafe against the rules and the discipline and the hierarchy, not because she doesn't understand their purpose, but because something in her nature resists any authority she hasn't actively chosen to accept. And we watch Izagi manage all of this with a combination of absolute firmness and patient, almost concealed affection that is one of the more genuinely moving things in the film. She is not soft with Nawi. She does not protect her from the consequences of her mistakes. But she also never abandons her, never writes her off, never lets the frustration of a particularly difficult day translate into giving up. There is something deeply maternal in how Izagi relates to Nawi, and the film knows it. It is careful to let us feel this without announcing it, to let it emerge naturally from the accumulation of small moments rather than forcing it through explicit statement. What the training sequences do beyond simply showing physical development is reveal the Agogi's philosophy, their code of existence, their understanding of what they are and what they exist for. Izagi explains it to Nawi, and later Naniska will explain aspects of it, and what emerges is a framework that is both remarkable and genuinely complicated. The Agogi do not belong to themselves. Not in the way ordinary women in Dahomey belong to themselves, which is to say not much. But they have surrendered even the small freedoms of ordinary womanhood, the freedom to choose a husband, to bear children, to have a private domestic life that exists outside of the warrior sisterhood. These are not incidental sacrifices. They are the price of admission to a world in which women hold genuine power, genuine authority, genuine respect. They are the exchange. In return for what they have given up, the Agogi receive something almost unprecedented for women in any society of the 19th century. They receive autonomy within their structure. They receive physical sovereignty. Their bodies belong to them, are their own instruments rather than the property of husbands or fathers. They receive the profound loyalty and love of a sisterhood that has been forged in shared extremity. And they receive, perhaps most valuably, perhaps most dangerously, the knowledge of their own capability. These women know what they are capable of because they have been systematically and relentlessly pushed to the edges of what a human body and mind can endure and have survived the pushing. The film is smart and honest enough not to present this framework as uncomplicatedly wonderful. Even as we admire these women, even as we feel the power and beauty of what they have built together, we are also asked to sit with what has been given up. The training sequence has a moment, quiet, easy to miss, where one of the recruits asks a senior warrior if she ever regrets not having children, not having a husband, not having the life she might have had outside the walls of the Agogi compound. The senior warrior answers without sentiment, without the performed cheerfulness of someone trying to convince themselves of something. She answers honestly. She has moments of regret. She also has the life she chose. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The film trusts you to hold both. While the training storyline is unfolding with all its physical and emotional richness, the film is running a parallel thread through Naniska's political world, and this thread is just as important to the story's ultimate meaning as anything that happens in the training compound. Naniska has a mission that extends far beyond the battlefield. She has a conviction, urgent, personal, rooted in something she has seen and experienced in ways the film is not yet ready to fully reveal, that the kingdom of Dahomey must disentangle itself from its participation in the transatlantic slave trade. This is not a casual political preference. This is not simply an enlightened moral position she has arrived at through abstract reasoning. This is a belief she carries in her bones, a belief that is connected to her deepest wounds and her deepest understanding of what human beings are and what they owe each other. She brings this argument repeatedly to King Gizo. And these scenes between Davis and Boyega are some of the film's most intellectually engaging sequences. Two highly intelligent, highly capable people with genuine respect and affection for each other, operating from genuinely irreconcilable positions and trying to find a way through. Gizo is not a villain. I want to be clear about this because the film is clear about it, and it matters. He is a king, a thoughtful, strategically sophisticated king, navigating an extraordinarily difficult political landscape. He leads a kingdom surrounded by more powerful neighbors. The Oyo Empire, in decline but still formidable, represents an existential military threat. Other neighboring kingdoms have their own ambitions. And the wealth from the slave trade, the cattle, the weapons, the goods traded in exchange for enslaved human beings, has been the economic lifeblood that has allowed Dahomey to maintain its independence. Take away that economic foundation, and the entire structure becomes vulnerable to the enemies circling it. Gizo understands Naniska's moral argument. He is not obtuse. He is not dismissive. He listens, and you can see in Boyega's careful, measured performance that the argument reaches him, that some part of him is moved by it. But he is a pragmatist in the most demanding possible sense of that word. He is a pragmatist in a world where the cost of being wrong is not embarrassment or political defeat, but the enslavement or slaughter of everyone he is responsible for. Pragmatism, in his position, has a body count attached to every decision. And Nanisca's moral clarity, as genuine and correct as it is, does not make the practical problems go away. This tension between Nanisca's moral urgency and Gizo's strategic caution, between what is right and what is possible, between the world as it should be and the world as it actually is one of the film's most mature and nuanced thematic threads. It does not resolve cleanly. It is not meant to. Real change of the kind Nanisca is demanding, the dismantling of an entire economic system that has sustained a kingdom, does not happen because one person makes a compelling argument. It happens slowly, incompletely, through the accumulation of pressure and consequence, and, eventually, through the kind of political shift that only becomes possible when external circumstances force the issue. The film understands this. It is not naive about how power works. Meanwhile, the geopolitical situation is deteriorating rapidly. The Oyo Empire's general, Oba Ade, is making his intentions toward Dahomey increasingly clear. He wants to bring Dahomey back under Oyo's dominance, to reassert the kind of control that the Oyo once exercised over smaller neighboring kingdoms. And he is doing this partly through military threats and partly through political manipulation, working in conjunction with the Portuguese slave traders, represented in the film by the deeply unpleasant Santo Ferreira, to create leverage over Dahomey by controlling access to the slave trade networks that the kingdom currently depends on. The Portuguese traders in the film are not cartoonishly evil, though their business certainly is. They are cold, transactional, entirely focused on profit, and utterly indifferent to the humanity of the people whose bodies are the commodity at the center of their enterprise. Ferreira in particular represents a specific and historically accurate type, the European colonial operator who has become so practiced at the dehumanization required by the slave trade that he no longer notices he is doing it. He sees people as inventory. He talks about them in the language of accounting. And the film, wisely, does not give him a redemptive arc or a crisis of conscience. Some people are simply what they do, and what he does is inexcusable. Into this complicated, dangerous web arrives Malik. Jordan Bolger's Malik is a young man of mixed heritage. His father was Brazilian, his mother Dahamean, and he carries the specific wound of the African diaspora in his very bloodline. He is connected to the Portuguese traders, working with them as something between a business associate and an employee, but he is deeply uncomfortable in that world. He has inherited from his mixed identity an understanding of the slave trade that the pure European traders around him will never have. He has family on both sides of the transaction, in a sense. People who were taken, people who prospered from the taking. And that knowledge sits in him like a splinter. When he encounters Nawi, in circumstances that the film arranges with a certain amount of narrative convenience, but that the actors sell with enough genuine chemistry to make work, there is an immediate recognition between them. Not romantic at first. Something more fundamental. Two young people who are not quite of any single world, who don't fit cleanly into any of the categories that their society has prepared for them. That shared displacement is the foundation of whatever grows between them. The romantic subplot between Nawi and Malik has been the element of the film most consistently debated among critics and viewers. I will give my honest assessment later, in the critical review section, but for now let me trace what it does and why it exists in the film's architecture. Beyond the obvious function of providing an emotional counterpoint to the film's action and political threads, the Nawi-Malik relationship does something thematically important. It connects Nawi's personal story, her search for belonging and identity, to the larger historical question of the African diaspora. Malik is not just a love interest. He is a living consequence of the slave trade. His existence is what the trade produced, a person untethered from any single culture, belonging to none, able to see clearly from the outside what those inside cannot see, because they are too embedded in it. His relationship with Nawi is, in a sense, a conversation between Dahomey and its diaspora, between the Africa that remained and the Africa that was carried away. Whether the film fully earns this thematic weight through the actual scenes of the relationship is a question we will return to. But the intention is legitimate, and the execution is not without merit, even if it is not entirely seamless. Now we need to talk about the secret at the heart of this film. And I need to approach it the way the film approaches it, with care, with patience, with an awareness that the power of the revelation depends entirely on the foundation laid before it. From very early in the film, you sense that Naniska carries something extraordinary inside her. It is not simply the weight of command, though she carries that too. It is something more personal, more deeply buried, more actively suppressed. There are moments, small, brief, quickly controlled, where something crosses her face when she looks at Nawi that is not tactical, not strategic, not the expression of a commanding officer evaluating a recruit. It is something else. Something she immediately, almost angrily, shuts down. Viola Davis plays these moments with an exactness that is almost frightening. She lets you see the thing almost surfacing, and then she controls it with the same focus, that she uses to control everything else in her life. And every time, you are left with the half-formed awareness that something is here, beneath the surface, that you don't yet understand. Amenza knows. This is one of the film's quietest and most important revelations, the understanding that Naniska's oldest friend and most trusted companion has been carrying this knowledge alongside her for a long time. Sheila Adam plays Amenza's knowledge as a form of vigilant protection. She watches Naniska watching Nawi, and what crosses her face is not surprise but a careful, alert awareness. She is holding space for a reckoning that she knows is coming, that she has perhaps known was coming from the moment Nawi walked through the palace gates, and she is ready to help Naniska survive it. The revelation that Naniska is Nawi's mother arrives not as a single dramatic announcement, but through a process of accumulation, through details that align, through physical resemblances that suddenly become impossible to ignore, through the specific way that Naniska's interest in Nawi stops being explicable by anything other than the truth. When it fully lands, when Naniska allows herself, in a private moment of aloneness that Viola Davis plays with devastating precision, to fully understand what she has been resisting understanding, the emotional impact is enormous. Here is the history. Years ago, many years before Nawi was born, before Naniska was the general, when she was someone younger and less armored, she was captured by Oyo soldiers during a raid. She was held captive. She was violated. She became pregnant from that violation. And when the child was born, a daughter, she made the most terrible decision of her life. She arranged for the child to be given away, not because she didn't love her, not because she was indifferent, but because in her understanding of what her life needed to be, what she needed to become in order to survive and eventually lead and fight back, a child would be impossible. A child would require the kind of openness, the kind of vulnerability, the kind of love that she had decided was incompatible with survival. So she gave her away. And she buried that decision under everything else she built on top of it, the rank, the reputation, the discipline, the walls upon walls upon walls. And then Nawi walked through the palace gates. The film handles this reveal with admirable restraint, and I want to credit Gina Prince Bythewood specifically for this choice. A lesser director, a director more interested in easy emotional manipulation, would have built to a single dramatic confrontation scene where everything comes out at once in a flood of tears and confessions. Prince Bythewood does something harder and more true. She lets the understanding seep through the film gradually, lets it change the texture of every scene between Naniska and Nawi in retrospect, lets the audience carry the knowledge forward into subsequent scenes before either character is ready to speak it aloud. By the time the truth is said directly, we have been living with it long enough that its saying feels less like an explosion and more like the opening of a wound that has needed to be opened for a very long time. And Viola Davis, in that private moment of reckoning, when Naniska finally, fully lets herself know, gives us something that is among the most genuinely moving pieces of screen acting in recent memory. It is not theatrical grief. It is the specific, quiet, internal disintegration of someone whose last defense against an unbearable truth has finally given way. She doesn't scream. She doesn't weep noisily. She just breaks somewhere deep inside, in a way that you can see in her face and her shoulders and the way she goes momentarily still as though the ground has shifted beneath her. And then she puts herself back together because this is what she does, this is who she is, this is the terrible expertise she has built over decades. But the putting back together is visible now. The seams show. And that visibility is itself a kind of progress. When Nawi learns the truth, the film enters its most emotionally complex territory. The discovery does not come through a gentle conversation. It comes through the kind of accumulation and confrontation that actual revelations in actual lives tend to involve, confusing pieces that don't quite add up until they suddenly, horribly do. And Thusom Badu plays Nawi's response with a rawness that is absolutely fearless. There is grief for the childhood she didn't have, for the mother she didn't know, for the years of feeling unwanted and redirected and insufficient. There is rage, clean, hot, legitimate rage at the choice Naniska made, even if Nawi intellectually understands the circumstances that produced it. And there is something else underneath both the grief and the rage, a terrible, disorienting relief. Because all the things that haven't made sense, the pull she's felt toward Naniska, the way Naniska's expectations of her have felt different from anyone else's, the way it is felt, against all evidence, like Naniska was paying a particular kind of attention, all of it suddenly makes a devastating kind of sense. The film does not rush from this revelation to reconciliation. It does not offer the clean catharsis of a tearful embrace that makes everything okay. What it offers is something more honest and more difficult, the beginning of a process. A process that looks, in the real world, like two people who love each other but who have both been shaped by loss and pain, and the specific psychological armor that loss and pain produce, very slowly, very carefully, beginning to test whether the armor can come off without everything falling apart. There is a scene, and I want to be careful about describing it without diminishing it, because it lives in the details of performance more than in any plot summary, where Naniska and Nawi are in proximity with the knowledge between them, not speaking about it directly, moving around each other with a careful, wary, desperately tender quality of people who want something they have not yet figured out how to ask for. Davis and Badu in this scene together are extraordinary. They are operating at exactly the same frequency, building something between them that exists in glances and pauses, and the slight shift in how a body holds itself when it is in the presence of its greatest vulnerability. It is quiet, devastating, beautiful filmmaking, and it is the emotional core that makes everything else in the final act carry the weight it needs to carry. As all of this is building toward its interior reckoning, the external world is building toward its crisis. The Oyo Empire launches a major, coordinated military offensive against Dahomey. Oba aids forces, larger than anything the Agoji have faced and operating in conjunction with Portuguese military support, descend on the kingdom with the intention of bringing it permanently to heel. The threat is existential, not just to Dahomey's political independence, but to the Agoji specifically, whose existence as a force represents a particular kind of affront to the Oyo's conception of proper order. What follows is a series of battle sequences that are, from a pure filmmaking perspective, some of the finest sustained action filmmaking in recent Hollywood history. And I do not say that hyperbolically. I say it as someone who has watched a great deal of action cinema and who is genuinely tired of the conventions that most of it relies on. The shaky camera designed to create excitement by obscuring what's actually happening, the arbitrarily dark photography that hides the difficulty of choreography, the editing that cuts so fast that spatial coherence becomes impossible, the reliance on CGI spectacle that never feels as real as the human body actually performing actual things. The Woman King does none of these things. Gina Prince Bythewood and cinematographer Polly Morgan stage these battles with a clarity and kinetic specificity that is genuinely thrilling because you can see everything. Every strike, every counter, every moment of brutal, exhausted, determined human contact. The choreography, which was developed over months of preparation with cast members who underwent genuinely intensive physical training, is individualized and character-specific in a way that makes it narratively meaningful. You are not watching generic action. You are watching these particular women, with these particular histories and personalities and physical capabilities, fighting in a way that is uniquely theirs. The Agoji in battle function as a collective intelligence. They communicate without words, adjust to changing conditions in real time, protect each other with an almost reflexive awareness of where every member of the unit is at every moment. The camera honors this collectivity by maintaining spatial coherence. You always have a sense of where the fighters are relative to each other, relative to the enemy, relative to the objective. This sounds like a minimum requirement for action filmmaking, but it is surprisingly rarely met in contemporary Hollywood productions. The clarity here is not accidental. It is the result of meticulous planning and the kind of physical preparation that allows actors to execute complex choreography at full speed without the safety net of editing tricks. And in the middle of all of it, Leading the Agoji through the most dangerous sequence of engagements the unit has faced is Naniska, Viola Davis in full battle mode. And I want to take a moment with this because it is worth taking a moment with. There are action heroes in Hollywood films. Lots of them. And they come in all shapes and sizes, and there are certainly excellent ones. But Naniska is something I have not quite seen before on an American screen, a middle-aged black woman as the apex of physical and martial authority, leading an army not as a symbol or a figurehead, but as the most capable fighter in the unit, the one they follow into the worst of the fight because they know she will find a way through. Davis prepared for this role with a commitment that was genuinely remarkable, months of training, learning actual Agoji-inspired movement and combat techniques, building the physical capability required not just to perform the fight choreography, but to perform it with the specific quality of someone for whom this is second nature. What she brings to these battle sequences is not simply impressive physicality, though the physicality is impressive. It is the way she carries Naniska's history in her body during these moments, the exhaustion behind the power, the grief behind the ferocity, the 30 years of this life accumulated in every movement. She fights like someone who has been keeping score for a very long time and intends to collect every debt. And that emotional specificity transforms what might otherwise be spectacular but abstract action sequences into something deeply personal and deeply meaningful. Nawi's journey through the final battle is the completion of everything the training sequences set up over the film's first 2 acts. She arrives at this moment still impulsive, still prone to acting before fully thinking, but now there is a foundation beneath the impulse. There is technique. There is awareness of the people around her. There is, most importantly, something to fight for that she has consciously, freely chosen, not because she has no other options, not because she has been given away or redirected by someone else's decision, but because she has looked at this life, at these women, at what they stand for and what they protect, and decided that this is where she belongs and what she is willing to bleed for. That choice, voluntary, informed, costly, transforms her fighting from something reactive to something intentional. She is no longer just fighting. She is fighting for. The battle sequences in the 3rd act contain several individually extraordinary moments that deserve mention. There is a sequence involving Izagi that I will not describe in detail because to do so would constitute a genuine spoiler, but the emotional weight of it and Lashana Lynch's work in the moments leading up to it is such that I have heard from multiple people, including grown men who laughed at themselves for it, that they cried openly in theaters. The film earns this moment completely. It has been building toward it for the entire 2nd act, quietly and carefully, and when it arrives it is not manipulative. It is devastating in the way that only truthful, earned storytelling can be devastating. The defeat of the Oyo forces is hard-won and costly. The Agoji take losses that will not be forgotten or easily recovered from. The victory is real, but the victory has weight, the weight of everything it cost, the weight of everyone who did not make it to the other side. And the film does not let you celebrate without feeling that weight. It does not allow a triumphant score to wash over the grief and make everything feel clean and resolved. The Agoji win, and then they mourn. And the mourning is as fully rendered and as cinematically honored as the fighting that preceded it. In the political aftermath of the battle's outcome, Gizo makes his move. Slowly. Incompletely. With the caution of a man who has been balancing too many incompatible obligations for too many years. But he begins to move in the direction that Naniska has been pointing. The slave trade's hold on Dahomey begins, tentatively, and not yet irreversibly, to loosen. It is not the triumphant resolution that a less honest film would have given us. It is a beginning, a door cracked open. And in the context of what it would have taken historically, politically, economically to even crack that door, it is significant. The film closes on Naniska and Nawi, not on a battlefield, not in a political meeting, not in a scene of collective triumph, on 2 women. One who has spent decades surviving by closing every door that feelings might enter through. One who has spent her whole life standing at closed doors and not knowing why nobody was opening them. And between them, not a resolution, not a tidy emotional package with a bow on top, but the beginning of something honest. the first real, undefended moment of connection between a mother and a daughter who found each other by accident and circumstance and the inexorable pull of blood, having already been through enough together to know that whatever comes next is worth the risk of trying. It is a quiet ending, deliberately quiet, and in its quietness it says everything that the 2 hours and 15 minutes of fire and battle and revelation before it has been building toward. That the most revolutionary act is not defeating your enemies on the battlefield, though that matters. The most revolutionary act is allowing yourself to be loved. Let's go deeper on the characters now, because every major figure in this film deserves more space than they get in a straight narrative retelling. Naniska, as a character, represents a specific and relatively rare archetype in American cinema, the woman who has built her entire identity on the ashes of everything that was taken from her. This is not an unusual experience for women. The experience of having things taken, of reconstructing yourself from the wreckage, of choosing capability and control over vulnerability, because vulnerability has been proven to be dangerous. But it is unusual to see it treated with this level of complexity and psychological honesty on screen, and rarer still to see it embodied by a Black woman of Viola Davis's age and presence. Naniska has been many things before she is the general. She was a girl. She was a captive. She was a victim. She was a mother for the briefest and most devastating possible period. And then she chose, as deliberately and as entirely as it is possible for a human being to choose anything, to be none of those things anymore. She chose to be a warrior instead. She chose to pour every ounce of herself into the Agoge, into the defense of Dahomey, into the physical and tactical and moral excellence that the role of general demanded. And that choosing was real and meaningful and has produced something genuinely extraordinary, a person of almost incomprehensible capability and authority. But it has also produced a person with sealed rooms inside her. Rooms she hasn't entered in years. Rooms that hold the things she could not afford to carry and still become who she needed to be. Nawi forces those rooms open, not through argument, not through confrontation, at least not initially, but simply through being who she is, through the specific combination of her face and her stubbornness and her capacity for love that she hasn't yet learned to hide. Naniska sees herself in Nawi, and she sees who she might have been in Nawi, and she sees the daughter she gave away in Nawi, and the convergence of all those recognitions is something her armor was simply not built to contain. Davis's great achievement in this film, and it is one of the great screen performances of the last decade, I will not hedge that statement, is the management of Naniska's interiority across 2+ hours of screen time. She is always thinking, always processing, always running the calculations of consequence and strategy and emotional cost, and always maintaining the surface of command even as the interior is shifting, cracking, reorganizing. The performance is a masterclass in what cinema allows that stage cannot, the close-up that catches the thing happening beneath the controlled expression, the micro-expression that lasts a fraction of a second but changes everything you understand about a scene. Davis gives you all of this with such precision that on a second viewing, the entire film looks different because you can trace the arc of Naniska's interior journey through the accumulation of these small moments. Nawi is constructed as Naniska's counterpart and mirror, the woman Naniska might have been without the violation and the loss and the decades of defensive architecture. She is open where Naniska is closed, reactive where Naniska is strategic. She wears her heart essentially on the outside, which in this world is both her greatest vulnerability and, ultimately, her greatest strength, because it means she cannot be fully broken by the things that might break someone who has learned to hide their heart. You cannot take from someone what they have never concealed. Thosum Badu plays Nawi's arc with a completeness that never reduces her to her function in the narrative. She is not simply there to be the thing that breaks Naniska open. She is a full person with her own desires, her own fears, her own specific and particular way of moving through a world that has given her very little to feel secure about. The training sequences are where Badu does her most technically demanding work, The physical transformation is real, and the internal transformation she conveys alongside it is equally real. By the film's end, Nawi is not the girl who is dragged to the palace by a frustrated father. She is something forged, something chosen, something that knows exactly what it is, and has decided that being this thing is enough. More than enough. Isagi's function in the film, emotionally, narratively, thematically, is something that deserves its own extended analysis. She is not a secondary character who exists in the service of the leads. She is a full protagonist in her own right who happens to be told in a slightly smaller space. Her relationship with Nawi is one of the most genuinely tender and specific relationships in the film. It has the quality of a sisterhood that has been waiting to happen, of two people who were made to be in each other's lives and have found each other just in time. And Lashana Lynch brings to Isagi a quality that is extremely rare in any kind of genre filmmaking. She is genuinely, infectiously funny without ever being comic relief. The humor comes from character. It comes from intelligence and self-possession and the specific kind of confidence that allows a person to be playful even in the middle of serious things. Isagi laughs because she is secure enough in herself to laugh. And that security, that groundedness, is what makes her such a powerful presence for Nawi, who is still in the process of finding her ground. King Gizo is perhaps the film's most historically and morally complicated figure, and John Boyega navigates that complication with considerable skill. The easy version of this role is one of two directions, either the wise, noble king who supports the hero's quest for justice, or the compromised ruler whose moral failures create the central conflict. Boyega refuses both reductions. His Gizo is a man of genuine quality and genuine limitations simultaneously. He is intelligent, politically sophisticated, personally brave, and genuinely fond of Naniska in a way that feels real and specific rather than purely symbolic. He is also the leader of a state that has participated in one of history's greatest crimes, and his pragmatic justifications for that participation, however grounded in the brutal reality of his political situation, cannot be entirely separated from the crime itself. The film, to its credit, does not try to fully rehabilitate Gizo. It presents his movement toward Naniska's position as real but incomplete, as the beginning of a change rather than a completed one. And this honesty, this refusal to give him a clean arc that resolves his moral complexity, is one of the more grown-up things the film does. Amenza is the film's quietest major character and perhaps its most emotionally intelligent. Sheila Adam plays her as someone who has made a specific and deliberate choice about the role she occupies. Witness, keeper, guardian. She does not seek the center. She does not compete for it. She watches from a position of clarity that only someone with no personal stake in the outcome can maintain, and she uses that clarity to serve the people she loves. Her love for Naniska is one of the oldest and most enduring things in the film. She has been with her through everything, has never looked away, has kept the secrets that needed keeping and told the truths that needed telling. Adam gives this character a stillness that reads not as passivity, but as chosen presence. She is there, fully and completely, in every moment she occupies. And in a film so full of motion and noise and urgency, that chosen stillness is its own form of power. The themes woven through The Woman King are numerous and rich, and they interact with each other in ways that reward careful attention and multiple viewings. The theme of freedom, its nature, its shape, its cost, and the question of who is permitted to pursue it, is the film's most explicitly stated preoccupation. Every major character in The Woman King is, in some essential way, engaged in a negotiation with freedom. The Agoji are free, genuinely, remarkably free by the standards of their world and their time, but their freedom has a specific architecture. It is freedom within structure, freedom in exchange for sacrifice, freedom purchased at the cost of certain very particular kinds of personhood. The film asks consistently and without easy answers whether this is the only kind of freedom available, whether freedom ever comes without conditions, and whether conditions placed on freedom by a benevolent structure are qualitatively different from conditions placed on it by an oppressive one? The answer the film ultimately reaches, not through argument but through storytelling, is that this question, however important, is not the final question. The final question is what you do with the freedom you have, however shaped and bounded it is. Whether you use it in service of something larger than yourself. Whether the exercise of your bounded freedom contributes to the possibility of a less bounded freedom for those who come after you. Nanisca's life has been a long answer to that question. And what the film suggests is that the answer has been worth giving. The body as a site of both power and violation runs deeper through this film than almost any other theme, and it connects the personal to the political in ways that are absolutely central to what the film is doing. The Agoge have transformed their bodies into instruments of their own will, which is itself a radical political act in a world that has assigned women's bodies to the ownership of fathers, husbands, kings, and slavers. Their physical excellence is not just impressive. It is a declaration. It is an argument made in flesh and muscle and bone and blood. These bodies belong to the people inside them. But the film also does not allow this declaration to obscure the ways in which women's bodies in its world are violated, owned, and traded. Nanisca's rape. The young women given to the king as gifts. The captives bound for the slave trade, whose bodies are literally being sold. These threads of violation run through the story, like a dark undertow, and they are what give the Agoge's physical sovereignty its meaning. They exist as the living counterargument to a world that treats women's bodies as property. And the film insists on the truth of both the declaration and what it is responding to, because without the context of violation, the declaration is just spectacle. Motherhood, in all its forms, both biological and chosen, both present and absent, both lost and recovered, is the film's most intimate and enduring theme. The conventional narrative of motherhood as biology, as the natural destiny of womanhood, is questioned and complicated from the very beginning of the film. The Agoge have explicitly declined conventional motherhood as the condition of their membership in the sisterhood. And yet the film is saturated with maternal dynamics, the way Izagi mothers the recruits, the way senior warriors carry the younger ones, the way the entire structure of the Agoge is, in a sense, a maternal structure even as it formally rejects motherhood. Motherhood here is not a biological category. It is a practice, a choice, a form of love that can exist between any two people who decide to show up for each other with that specific, total, unconditional quality. And at the center of all of this, Nanisca and Nawi, the mother and daughter who find each other after years of being lost to each other, enact the most literal version of the theme. The love between them is, in the film's ultimate reading, the most powerful force in the story. Not the military prowess, not the political maneuvering. The love between a woman who gave away everything she could not carry and the daughter who grew up carrying all of it without knowing what it was. That love, and the impossibly difficult work of making it real between two people who have both been changed by loss, is what the film is most fundamentally about. The film also engages with questions of legacy and inheritance, what we pass down, what we choose to pass down, what we discover we have been passing down even when we didn't know we were doing it. Nanisca gives Nawi her discipline, her ferocity, her standards, her understanding of what is worth fighting for, and she gives all of this before she knows she is giving it, through the structure of the Agoge rather than through any conscious act of parental transmission. And what Nawi gives back, the demand for honesty, for acknowledgement, for the kind of love that doesn't hide behind armor even when armor is more comfortable, is its own inheritance. The cycle runs in both directions, and the film's most optimistic claim is that even the most broken cycles can be interrupted, redirected, eventually healed. On the craft of the filmmaking itself, I want to go into genuine detail, because The Woman King is a film where the technical and artistic decisions are consistently meaningful and deserve more analysis than they typically receive in mainstream reviews. Gina Prince Bythewood's direction is the foundation on which everything else rests, and I think she is significantly underrecognized as a filmmaker, partly because her films are often categorized as women's films or genre films in ways that tend to exclude them from the prestige conversation, and partly because her specific gift is a kind of precise emotional intelligence rather than a particular visual signature or style. She is a director who serves her stories rather than imposing herself on them, which can make her direction look invisible even when it is doing extraordinarily skilled work. What Prince Bythewood does with this film, which is, let's be clear, a significantly larger physical and logistical undertaking than anything she had directed before, is bring her characteristic emotional precision to bear on an epic canvas without losing the intimacy that gives her films their power. She never lets the scale of the battle sequences become an end in itself. Every action scene is designed, specifically and intentionally, to reveal character and advance the emotional story. The fights are not interruptions to the drama. They are the drama, expressed in the language of physical conflict. She also makes a directorial choice that runs against the grain of much contemporary action cinema and is worth naming explicitly. She gives her battle sequences time. Not endless time, not self-indulgent time, but enough time that the spatial and emotional logic of each engagement can register fully. You are never confused about who is fighting whom, what the tactical situation is, how it is developing. This clarity is the result of meticulous planning, storyboarding, choreography rehearsal, on-set coordination between the fight team and the camera department, and it pays off in the specificity and comprehensibility of what makes it to screen. Polly Morgan's cinematography is one of the film's great unsung achievements. Morgan, making her major feature debut at this scale, brings to the film a visual philosophy that is specific and coherent and deeply informed by the cultural world she is depicting. The palette is rich, reds, golds, the deep, saturated greens of the West African landscape, in a way that consciously rejects the tendency of war films to desaturate their visuals in the name of grittiness. The world of Dahomey is beautiful. It is complex and living and full, and the camera honors that fullness rather than aestheticizing its suffering. The indoor scenes have a specific visual quality, the warm, firelit interior of the Agoji compound, the more formal and architecturally complex spaces of the palace, that gives each environment its own character. The compound feels lived in, communal, heated by the specific kind of warmth that comes from shared physical space and shared life. The palace feels more formal, more performed, more aware of its own significance. And the outdoor spaces, particularly the battle sequences, which were shot largely on location in South Africa, have a scale and a naturalness that grounds the epic action in the real world. The costume design by Gersha Phillips is extraordinary both aesthetically and philosophically, and I want to spend a moment on it because costume design in historical films is often discussed purely in terms of authenticity, without engaging with its expressive function. The Agoji's fighting attire, the crop tops, the wrap skirts, the jewelry and beading that is not removed even in battle, communicates a specific and intentional philosophical argument. These women have not given up femininity in order to become warriors. They have integrated it. Their beauty and their lethality coexist without contradiction, because in their understanding of what they are, there is no contradiction to resolve. Beauty is not vulnerability. Femininity is not weakness. These are tools, among others, in the arsenal of a complete human being. The costume design makes this argument visually, in every single scene, without ever needing to state it aloud. The music by Terence Blanchard, one of the most celebrated jazz composers and musicians in America, best known for his long collaboration with Spike Lee, is genuinely distinctive in the context of this kind of film. Blanchard's approach draws on West African musical traditions and structures, incorporating rhythms and tonal qualities rooted in the culture being depicted, while also incorporating elements of his jazz background, particularly in the score's capacity for improvisation-like passages that feel responsive to the action on screen rather than simply accompanying it. The result is a score that sounds like nothing else in contemporary Hollywood cinema, and that is entirely appropriate for a film that is itself unlike anything else in contemporary Hollywood cinema. The fight choreography, as I have mentioned, deserves special recognition. The work done by Alexa Marcelino and her team, and by the cast members who committed to months of preparation, is among the best in the genre. What makes it exceptional is not the spectacular quality of individual moments, though there are genuinely spectacular individual moments. It is the consistency of character within the choreography. Every fighter in this film fights like themselves. Naniska fights like Naniska. Nawi fights like Nawi. Izagi fights like Izagi. And this individuation, maintained through months of preparation and execution, is what transforms the action from impressive spectacle into genuinely meaningful storytelling. Now for the honest critical assessment. Because a film this important, this carefully made, this culturally significant deserves honesty above all things. The Woman King's strengths are profound and numerous, and we have spent considerable time on them. But its weaknesses are real, and they deserve attention too. The Malik subplot, Nawi's romantic relationship with a half-Brazilian trader, is, in my assessment, the film's single most significant structural weakness. Not because the relationship is badly executed. Bolger and Mbadu have genuine chemistry, and the scenes between them are not without value. But because the film gives it more time and weight than it has fully earned, and in doing so takes time away from relationships that are richer and more original. In a film so densely packed with extraordinary female bonds, Naniska and Nawi, Nawi and Izagi, Naniska and Amenza, the space given to a conventional heterosexual romance feels like a concession to a model of storytelling that the rest of the film is actively arguing against. The film's handling of the historical reality of Dahome's participation in the slave trade is the area where the intellectual honesty of the project is most genuinely tested. The criticism from African historians and scholars that the film positions Dahome's general as a heroic abolitionist without sufficiently reckoning with the degree to which Dahomey and the Igoji were active, willing participants in the capture and sale of enslaved Africans, is not easily dismissed. The film's creative team has addressed this in various interviews, and their argument is coherent. They are making a work of dramatic fiction inspired by history. The moral tension around the slave trade is explicitly present in the film, and Naniska's abolitionist position is meant to dramatize an internal reckoning within Dahomey rather than erase the historical reality. These are valid points. But a film of this ambition, one explicitly drawing on and invoking real history, carries an obligation that pure fantasy does not. And the degree to which it softens the edges of that history, by making Naniska the obvious moral hero, and Gizo the figure who is perhaps persuadable, but who hasn't quite gotten there yet, while the full weight of Dahome's complicity remains somewhat in the background, is a compromise that will sit differently with different viewers, and that deserves to be named. This is not to say the film should have been different. Art is not documentary. Drama requires choices and emphases that truth in its raw form does not provide. But the controversy is real, the scholars raising it are serious, and engaging with their critique honestly is part of taking the film seriously as a cultural artifact rather than simply as entertainment. The third act has structural issues that become more visible on second viewing. The resolution of Naniska and Nawi's relationship, while emotionally satisfying in the moment, moves somewhat faster than the depth of the wound strictly warrants. The political resolution involving Gizo, his movement toward the abolition of the slave trade, is handled with a hopefulness that the historical record cannot quite sustain. These are the marks of a film that is perhaps slightly too in love with its own emotional arc to resist tidying things up a little more than the material strictly demands. These weaknesses do not diminish the film's achievement. They contextualize it. They are the specific costs of making a very ambitious film about a very complicated history for a very large audience, and negotiating all of those demands imperfectly is not a failure. It is the inevitable result of the attempt itself. Compared to the films it invites comparison with, and it invites many, The Woman King stands up extraordinarily well. Against Black Panther, which created a fictional African utopia and did so with immense skill and cultural impact, but without the obligation to historical specificity that this film carries, The Woman King's engagement with actual history gives it a weight and seriousness that Wakanda, by design, cannot have. Against Glory, which is one of the great films about Black soldiers and American history, but which primarily centers its story through the perspective of its white officer, The Woman King's refusal of any such mediating perspective feels like a genuine advance. Against Hidden Figures, another film about extraordinary Black women in history, The Woman King is darker, more complex, less concerned with respectability politics, and more willing to sit in the moral complications of its subject's world. Before I give the final verdict, there is one more thing I want to say about this film, something I think gets underweight in most of the conversation about it. The Woman King is a film about what women are capable of, not in the inspirational poster, "We can do it" sense, not in the "let me make a film to prove a point" sense, in the much more radical, much more quietly devastating sense of, here is what has always been true. Here is what the historical record shows. In the accounts of European soldiers who faced the Agoji and were stunned by what they encountered, in the oral histories of Dahomey, in the bones and weapons found in archaeological sites across what is now Benin. Here is what existed, undeniably, in the real world for 200 years. Here is what you were never taught. Viola Davis, in interviews about the film, has spoken about what it meant to her personally to play a role of this magnitude. She has spoken about being told across a long and distinguished career that she was not the right type for certain kinds of roles, that her Blackness, her age, her body type placed specific kinds of heroism and authority beyond her reach as an actress. She has spoken with characteristic directness and intelligence about the industry's persistent failure of imagination regarding who is permitted to be the center of a story, the person everyone else orbits, the one who leads. And there is something genuinely incandescent about watching her in every single frame of this film, not defying anyone's expectations, having moved so completely beyond the relevance of anyone else's expectations that the concept is simply no longer applicable. She is being, fully and without apology or performance, exactly who she is. And what she is extraordinary. That is what the best films do. They do not argue with the world. They do not debate it or prove it wrong with statistics. They simply show you something true and let the truth do the work that truth does when you give it the space to breathe. The final verdict. The Woman King is a deeply ambitious, visually stunning, emotionally rigorous, and culturally significant film anchored by one of the most powerful lead performances in American cinema in the last 10 years. It takes a story that the world has largely refused to tell, the story of the Agoji, of the kingdom of Dahomey, of African women warriors who existed and who fought and who loved and who deserved to be known, and it renders that story with a passion and a craft and an emotional intelligence that is genuinely rare in mainstream Hollywood production. Its weaknesses are real, and I have not hidden them. The romantic subplot could have been reduced or reconceived without loss. The historical complexities deserve more acknowledgement and engagement than they receive. The third act shows the seams of its own construction in ways that slightly reduce the power of its emotional resolutions. These are the limitations of a very ambitious film operating within a commercial industry that does not always provide the conditions for perfect artistic expression of perfect artistic ambition. But the strengths are overwhelming and enduring. Viola Davis. The Sombadu. Lashana Lynch.
Sheila Adam.
The cinematography of Polly Morgan. The fight choreography that makes every physical confrontation feel specific and true. The score by Terence Blanchard. The costume design by Gersha Phillips. The directorial vision of Gina Prince-Bythewood. The specific, irreplaceable emotional experience of watching women lead armies, lead each other, lead the moral conversation of a kingdom, and of watching that leadership rendered not as exceptional, but as natural, earned, inevitable. This is a film that matters. Not merely as entertainment, though it is genuinely excellent entertainment. Not merely as representation, though representation of this quality and this specificity matters enormously. It matters as a statement, as a declaration, as a piece of storytelling that expands what cinema is allowed to be about and who it is allowed to center. It matters because it proves, once again, that the most extraordinary human stories, the ones that shake you and stay with you and change something in how you see the world, are often the ones that have been waiting the longest to be told. My final rating for The Woman King is 8.5 out of 10. Possibly, on a day when I am watching the scene of Niniska's reckoning, or the sequence involving Isagi that I promise not to spoil, or the final quiet moment between a mother and her daughter at the end of a war, possibly a 9. It falls short of the very top tier not because of any single fatal flaw, but because of the accumulated small compromises that prevent it from being as fully and purely itself as it might have been. But 8.5 in my personal framework means this: I will watch it again. I have thought about it for weeks. It has stayed with me in the way that only the films that actually tell you something true about the world stay with you. Viola Davis's face in the moment she finally understands what she has been resisting understanding is still in my mind. The sound of the agoge moving through the dark in the opening sequence is still in my mind. The specific, undefended quality of the final scene between Niniska and Nawi is still in my mind. And the question that runs underneath everything, quiet but insistent, present in every battle and every training session and every political argument and every moment of suppressed grief, that question is still with me too. What does it cost to be free? What does it cost to love? What do we owe the daughters we have lost and the daughters we are still capable of finding? What are we, finally, when we have stripped away everything we built to survive? The Woman King doesn't want to merely entertain you and send you home. It wants to be remembered. It wants to be part of the long, slow, necessary work of telling the truth about what the world has always contained and who has always been capable of what. It wants to restore something, and on that ambition it succeeds. Completely, beautifully, at great cost, as all worthwhile things do. Go and watch it. Watch it loud. Watch it with someone who needs to see it. Watch it and let it work on you the way the best storytelling always does. Not as passive entertainment, but as active encounter, as an experience that asks something of you in return for what it gives. Sit with it after. Turn it over. Think about the agoge, the real ones who really lived, who really fought, who were really forgotten for far too long. Think about what it means that they existed. Think about what it means that this film exists. And when the final image fades and the music settles and you're left sitting wherever you are with something full and unresolved and true moving through you, you'll know exactly what all of this has been about. Some stories don't wait forever to be told. They just wait until the world is finally ready to hear them. The Woman King was always that story. We are very lucky it finally found its way to us.